All right. Well, hey, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Hero Makers podcast. And Ann, you know what today is? Today is National Compliment Day. I don't know if you knew this. It is. So I'm going to compliment you. And if you guys are going to watch this on YouTube, you'll see that Ann has a really beautiful necklace on, and I can't tell what it is, but it's like this dangling diamond that I'm staring at. What is that, Ann? Is that like a family necklace or?
No, it's been a gift, actually. It's a pearl from the Philippines from my friend in Manila. Thank you for asking.
Is that nice? Yeah, that's so great. You look beautiful, Ann. And it's also winter. And we got pelted here. You guys know I live right outside of Chicago, and we got pelted with like 7 inches of snow in the past 2 days. So it hasn't been a winter wonderland. It's just been perpetual shoveling going on here. And do you get this kind of snow up in Toronto? What are you getting right now?
This time last week, we had 50 centimeters of snow in 24 hours. So,
oh no. And then there's your Canadian, there's your metric conversion that I don't understand.
2 feet?
2 feet. That's a lot of snow. And 2 feet?
Yeah, 2 rulers high of snow. And some people were stuck on our biggest highway for like 8 hours.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
That's really crazy. Okay. We're going to have to ask our guest today about snow out in Massachusetts because Ariel Burger, welcome to the podcast, Ariel. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I'm going to introduce you in a second, but first I'm going to ask you about snow because I had been watching the news that you guys were getting a huge winter snow out there, or some kind of winter storm going on. Did you get that where you are?
We got some. We're used to it here. It doesn't tend to throw us. I mean, the weird thing here is that it can go from, minus 15 and a lot of snow and ice to suddenly being in the 50s the next day. So we never know what to expect, but it hasn't been that terrible so far.
Okay, good. It's kind of like the people in Wisconsin who really know, and they're Minnesotans. And my husband's in Minnesota. He loves winter. He knows how to handle winter. But Ariel, I am very excited about having you on the podcast. And if you guys haven't heard of Ariel, which I feel like you should, because Ariel, even before we invited you on the podcast, I had read a little bit about what you're doing. And so I'm thrilled that you're on. And you are Elie Wiesel. He was your mentor. And so you launched this institute called the Witness Institute, kind of in his memory. And what you do there is you basically empower emerging leaders, and you inspire people through some of what he kind of the way that he lived his life, and you are working towards social change, which just love that. We love that here on the podcast, and so we wanted to have you on talking a little bit about your own past and the Witness Institute. And then also this bigger picture of making our world a better place and how we can all be part of that. So we're grateful that you are taking the time to do this. And can you start, Ariel, by telling us a little bit about yourself and your upbringing? I know that you are actually a trained Orthodox rabbi, which is, you're the first we've had in the podcast. So we need to hear a little bit about that too.
Mazel tov.
Yeah, but tell us a little bit about your upbringing and a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's really, I love the work that you're doing, and God knows we need this kind of sharing of perspectives and spotlighting people who are doing great work with sincerity and creativity. I grew up within the Jewish community, what might be considered a complex background, with different influences and different experiences ranging from very, very, very traditional Jewish life and learning in my early schooling, which is really almost identical in certain ways to the way it might have looked 200 years ago in Eastern Europe. Not in every respect, but in many respects. We studied text, we studied Talmud and classical Jewish texts that really kind of train the mind in certain ways of thinking and inquiring into reality. And we prayed, and we were involved in liturgical life and the rhythm of the indigenous rhythm of the Jewish calendar, if you will. And at the same time, I was really connected to the modern world and and especially to creativity and the arts, both through my father, who's a composer, and also in my own life as a young person. I was really always into drawing and imagination and stories and fantasies and myth, and I read mythology a lot when I was a kid, and so I was kind of trained from an early age to really be comfortable with questions and to really seek questions and to ask a lot of questions about the connection, especially between tradition, my heritage, and any tradition, any human tradition, and creativity and self-expression. So that was a big part of my life growing up. And that's really the engine of a lot of my work is what's the relationship between the world as it's been and the wisdom that we've inherited, and then our own new insight, which the world is given to us. It's in our hands now to create something new, to offer something new. What's the relationship between tradition and creativity? And at the same time, I grew up with an older sister who's amazing and creative and musical and also blind. And so I had a lot of questions from an early age about how we include people in general and how we include people who are different in various ways. And that really has to do with these things are all connected for me because, you know, the inner and the outer mirror each other. So how do I include all the aspects of myself, my traditional self and my funky creative self? And how do we include everyone around us who, you know, each of whom brings a different gift, a different offering to our community and our life and our world?
You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking about tradition. And Ariel, like I think a lot of the role of tradition and history in our lives, I feel like a lot of people, they don't really discover the connection of history and their own history, collective or personal, until they get older, right? Like when they're kids, they're like, whatever, they kind of, you know, and then when you get older, you're like, oh, this really matters. So I'm wondering how like that you're being attached to this kind of this long tradition and legacy, whether it was like in the religious faith, cultural faith, or a cultural area, religious area. How did that form you into the person you are today, kind of being grounded in that bigger picture?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think a lot of cultures around the world, a lot of indigenous cultures, um, until modernity, did a lot of work on how to acculturate children and then initiate children into traditions. And I think it's one of the things that some of us have lost in modern times. And so I often work with people, activists and leaders who are really, really deeply shaped by their ancestral experiences of oppression, of liberation work. And we ask questions about, well, what stories are you carrying that you may not even be aware of that you're carrying,
Mm.
that have shaped you? And it turns out in every case that the stories we carry really do shape us. And to become aware of that is really important because then we can sort of work with it. We can make it conscious. We can make decisions about what do we want to take from the past and what do we want to leave behind.
Mm.
In my case, you know, I'm part of a tradition that it's really paradoxical and it remains fascinating to me. But the tradition itself is very much about creativity. The tradition itself is about how to constantly reinterpret and reimagine the tradition and reimagine sacred text and ideas,
Mm.
and how to constantly recreate this thing called Judaism.
Mm.
And so every moment is new, every generation is new, and yet there's this continuity. But at the center of the message of the past is you have to find ways to innovate. You have to find ways to honor the past by innovating. And so that sets up a really interesting dynamic where in traditional Jewish learning, we're always wrestling with the text. We're not just passively receiving it and saying, okay, whatever you say, God, whatever you say, text, whatever you say, tradition, we're pushing back, we're wrestling, just like in the tradition itself, Abraham argued with God and Moses argued with God. And, you know, this is a kind of touchstone of traditional Jewish thinking is kind of interpretive creativity. It's usually done with the text, with reading the Bible or other classical texts, sacred texts, and things like that. But the training really is about how to do that with life so that as you're walking in the world, you can start to interpret things correctly and analyze things
Mm.
with some precision. And most importantly, question yourself, interrogate yourself. So I grew up in a tradition and a culture that was very much about not not assuming things and not resting on your blind assumptions, and really challenging your own biases and ways of thinking about anything, not just hot button issues, but even the simple aspects of life. Why do you think what you think? How did you come to this? And is there a process of clarification that needs to happen to make me a better person, to make me a clearer person? So in that sense, it was my traditional background was very empowering. And it also gave me a sense of intimate conversation with people from a long time ago, which I think is offers a kind of like resilience and comfort maybe in tough times, that I'm part of something bigger than myself. But it also gives a tremendous responsibility that I'm carrying this tradition and I have to do something good with it and make sure it doesn't cause harm.
Thank you so much for explaining that. That just helps me so much. It's so encouraging to know that there's people like you out there, because I feel like you're holding a lot in balance, like the tradition and your faith and the history of that, but also really challenging yourself and I guess others. I wanted to know, like, do you do that on your own with your books, or do you journal, or do you write, poetry, or do you do that with others? And then how do you find that community of people?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
The typical thing where I come from in this kind of traditional Jewish environment, but in many Jewish environments today, and also many other contexts and cultures, a lot of introspection, a lot of time for contemplation. I do some practice every day of kind of personal meditation and prayer. That's the first thing I do in the morning, and then again later in the evening. And a lot of journaling. I've kept a journal since I was 15, and it's really been helpful. But there's a secret in this approach, which is it's not really so secret, but it tells us that if I'm walking around, and I'm walking around with all kinds of assumptions and blind spots. So the best way, and really ultimately, I think the only way to challenge that and shed light on those dark places where I might not be seeing clearly, is by encountering someone else with a totally different set of assumptions. And so the classical Jewish way of studying in many circles, and it happens a lot in contemporary, creative Jewish learning spaces as well, is actually two people sitting over a book and arguing, or reading and sharing. We would share our interpretations of the text we're reading, and we would come up with different ideas, and we'd push back against each other. It's a dialogue, and it's a dramatic dialogue, because we're not debating, and we're not even to win. We're trying to clarify our own thinking through that dialogue. So that's a traditional Jewish practice of study, which I've now used a lot in other contexts around peacemaking and conflict transformation, because it's such an effective way of shedding light on the places that I might not have examined. And in our culture, we're often freaked out by that encounter. Someone who believes something radically different than me is a threat, but it's very possible to look at that as a just incredible gift and an opportunity. I can learn so much from that encounter.
Boy, Ariel, as you're talking, we talk a lot about intentionality here on the podcast, and everything you're saying is pointing to that. It's like doing the hard inner work of ourselves and of other people, getting to know other people and listening and being present. But I want to hear more about, you're talking about kind of these heated conversations that are part of this process, and a lot of us are very hesitant to have conflict, right? Like we're very conflict averse, and we shut down. Like somebody thinks differently, says something differently, we shut down, and we're like, let's just go to a happy subject, or we walk away. And I would love if you would explain more about what healthy dialogue with somebody different looks like, and how it can lead to deeper relationships, lasting change. Why is there a time and a place for that kind of engagement?
I love that you're naming that some of us are conflict averse, and we lean back in the face of those heated conversations. They are difficult, they are challenging. But if you think about any relationship, with a partner or a spouse, for example, if you don't talk about things over a period of time, things are going to build up, and it's going to be explosive later. So you know, avoiding conflict just leads to a kind of multiplier effect where the conflict becomes much more intense because there's so many layers of unspoken pain and reactivity. So I think part of what we have to do is train ourselves to become more comfortable with conflict, or become more comfortable with being uncomfortable. Mm. And, you know, that's part of the work. And so we know there are ways of doing this. We know from people like Professor Elie Wiesel that it's possible to create environments of deep, deep, deep respect for the other. And as he said, for the otherness of the other, precisely for the difference in opinion and perspective of the other. That's the thing that's so mysterious and fascinating, and about which I can be so curious. And I can relate to it with a kind of playfulness and thirst to learn more. And I can get excited about being wrong about something. Those are cultivations of inner, you know, aspects or capacities in ourselves. That's a part of the work. But of course, we're talking about dialogue, so we can't do this alone. You know, to your question earlier, Anne, we can't do it alone, and we have to make sure that we're finding truly safe, hospitable, brave spaces in which to have these conversations, and we have to design them well. So this is, to me, this is partly a design question. How do we design spaces for these kinds of hard conversations? How do we make sure that there's truly a set of tools for the moments before, during, and after a difficult conversation, where we can all say the things that might be sensitive or controversial or unpopular or taboo in a spirit of inquiry, and not in order to win the conversation, but in order to surface and reveal some deeper layers of my own thinking and perhaps our collective wisdom. That's essential for us right now. And you know, there are a lot of people working on dialogue over my time exploring all of this. And a lot of this was in my experience in Israeli-Palestinian dialogue and peacemaking efforts, was really learning different techniques for creating those kinds of spaces, from nonviolent communication, which is a tool that's really worth looking into, or you know, other approaches like co-counseling, and you know, and then my own tradition and the traditional tools that I grew up with. It's definitely possible to do. It's definitely going to feel uncomfortable. It's definitely a good thing to create spaces in which we can be uncomfortable together. There's a teaching in my tradition in the Talmud where it says that the way that people study together, if they're really seeking truth, is even the people who are closest to each other, they get into it and they become, so to speak, in a bracketed sense, they become enemies in the conversation because they're pushing against each other. But by the end of the conversation, they embrace because they have participated together in this quest for truth. And so if we can really kind of come back to that sense that we're in this together, this is a collaborative effort in our very disagreement. We're each providing something essential to the conversation because we each have a different perspective. And I'm so grateful to you for having a different perspective. And I'm so excited to find a place where I wasn't seeing correctly, and where I can increase my consciousness about an issue. I mean, what a wonderful opportunity to have that kind of encounter with people. That's one of my my hopes and dreams for us.
You know, so as you're talking, I'm thinking, my brain is going into all these different areas. But you know what is, I'm also feeling something, which actually never happens on this podcast. I never actually feel anything. I think a lot. I feel sad in some ways. And this is why, because you mentioned the otherness of the other. You were talking about your sister, right? Like these different dimensions of your sister. And I'm just thinking about what are we missing out on when we don't take the time to do this work that you're talking about? And that makes me sad, because I think a lot of us are missing out on this fuller life and the fuller opportunities for relationships, and the intricacies of people, right? Like the things we think we know somebody, but we really don't know you, that because there's this little thing I don't know, or and I don't know what my question is in there, except maybe this is my question. What have you learned about yourself or about others that surprised you, maybe, as you've learned about the otherness of the other, or how we're so deep, right? Like we have so many parts of us. Has there anything that surprised you as you've done this kind of work?
Well, I want to first just honor the sharing that you just offered, because that itself is really beautiful. Thank you for that. I mean, that's what we're here really to do, just to share in an honest and open way what we're feeling as well as what we're thinking. That's a big part of the work. We live in a culture that really focuses on what we're thinking, come up with a great question, come up with a great policy solution. People don't sit around, I imagine, in the United Nations or various committees working on human rights issues or homelessness or hunger and talk about the grief that they feel.
Mm.
And I often wonder what it would look like if they did. So you're modeling that, and that itself is very, really precious. The thing that has surprised me the most, in addition to lots of specific learnings, I mean, of course, there's so much I could say about what I've learned from people living in other communities with other experiences. Um, so many things that I continue to learn from friends and colleagues who are in parts of other communities with other ancestral experiences and other contemporary experiences of injustice and so on. But one of the big things is, a lot of what we're talking about sharing here is aspirational. And so it's kind of like reaching for a vision of a better world. And for a long time, I thought that the movement of reaching for a better world is a movement upward towards a vision, towards the light, or towards the beautiful world that we imagine. And a lot of what I've found and what I continue to find, and it's again what you just did, Laurie, is teach us that the motion is actually downward. It's actually follow the sadness, follow the subterranean currents of the things that are unspoken or unsaid, the things that I'm feeling that I'm not even quite aware, that are hovering on the edge of my awareness. And if I follow those things, if you follow the sadness, you often find that that's leading you towards the light and towards growth and towards healing, because we spend so much time avoiding those things. And so much of the fabric of our social reality is built on top of these weak foundations that are filled with unspoken feelings and experiences and stories. So the motion is not up, it's really downward. And I'm not the first one to say this. There are psychologists who talk about this, and myths certainly that speak of this. But for me, that's been very surprising. And I've had to retrain myself in certain ways to not always run after the upward motion, but to allow myself to settle into, what's sort of under the surface, what's the movement downward and inward. Because invariably when I do that, there's some kind of gift, there's some kind of surprise, there's some kind of real learning, a real moment of aha and new understanding hiding there.
I love when you talk about movement, because as you were talking, I was thinking about this Catholic writer, Henry Nouwen. He also taught at Notre Dame, and he actually lived his last years here in Toronto. And he wrote a book called The Spiritual Life, the three movements. And the one that's inward is moving from loneliness to solitude, and kind of like grappling with yourself and your inner world. And then he also talked about reaching out, and that's the movement from hostility to hospitality. And I feel, and he said we can start with a posture of hostility. And so then we'd see each other as the enemy, or we're fighting against you, even your ideas. And then it's a movement towards, and it's not always just like a straight line. He's like, sometimes you waver back. But yeah, that was like such an inspiring book for me in my life.
I've been reading his The Life of the Beloved this past year. It's very beautiful. And he's one of the people I've found who's just so articulate about what it means to be a wounded healer and to be broken and whole, broken and yet able to give so much. And that's a big part of this work too. You can't really do this kind of work without acknowledging that, I can't, at least, without acknowledging that I'm broken and flawed, and there are a lot of things that I don't know, and I can begin from that place of not knowing, and then I can move, then I can grow, then things can happen. But if I figured it all out, and if it sounds like I figured anything out here, by the way, I haven't. This is all kind of a series of experiments and hypotheses and testing. But whenever I forget and I think I figured something out, I find that I'm a little bit more closed off, and I can't really encounter someone else in a genuine way. So it's a constant process of like stripping off layers of armor and allowing myself to feel those vulnerabilities that he describes so beautifully.
This is kind of tapping into another one of our hero making traits, is that we talk about humility. And I think we need to add like curiosity to that list or something. But it's kind of what you're touching, right? I mean, we put ourselves in perspective as well. But
Yeah.
can you share a little bit about your just your friendship with Elie Wiesel, and kind of how you met him and the formative nature of that? Because you're carrying on his work now, and you have an institute named after him. And so, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I never describe it as a friendship. It was really more of a discipleship.
Mm.
And I still, I just have so much gratitude and feeling of reverence when I think about him. But I met him, I wrote a book about this, so I won't share too much because it's out there. But I met him when I was a teenager. And when I was in the midst of a lot of these questions I was talking about earlier, and because he was somebody who was simultaneously deeply rooted in Jewish identity and Jewish life and learning, and his experience as a child of pre-war, pre-Holocaust Jewish life. And so we shared a language there of those classical texts and those traditional practices and all of that. But he was also a writer, and he was also so deeply involved in global human rights work and peacemaking efforts. So I saw him as somebody who could really bridge some of these worlds that I was just sort of looking at as a young person with a very urgent sense of puzzlement. Like, how am I going to make sense of all of this? I don't think that we have to choose between tradition and creativity and relevance and making the world better. I don't think we have to choose between our own particular identities. In my case, as a Jew, in someone else's case, as a Muslim or a Buddhist or any identity, and our universal human commitments. I think we can hold those together. And he really taught that. He really modeled that. So he stood up for people in Cambodia and Yugoslavia and Darfur, Rwanda and Darfur, and elsewhere throughout his life. And he did it all as a Jew, rooted in Jewish teachings, but in a very universal way. And so he became the person I started to go to with my hardest questions. He was incredibly generous with young people. He was just open to conversations. And he said to me, when I was 15, he said, "Come and see me and bring a question." It took a while for me to build up the courage to do so, but eventually I was sort of desperate. I was like really asking these questions with some intensity. And so I went to him and started a series of conversations that lasted for a long time. And then I studied with him at Boston University, where he taught for almost 40 years and became his teaching assistant. And, I think his voice is really missing right now in our conversations about things like dialogue and the search for justice, and how do we rehumanize our society. Those are the things that he taught, and he really taught us how to grapple with. And so I really, there's so much to say, but I had the incredible blessing of sitting in his classroom for several years and really watching as he activated students from around the world and different ages as moral agents, as moral leaders, and in the sense not of moralizing and not necessarily in a formal role as a leader, but just sort of helping young people find their capacity, their voice, and their capacity to make things better in a variety of ways, in lots of different disciplines and approaches. And so, because I got to see all of that, and I was paying attention to the methods he used, I started to sort of tease out the primary methods that he was using. And a lot of it had to do with study, with learning, with reflection, with imagining, with really using our imagination to empathize with people who are different and really imagine the subtleties of what it is to live a different life. There's an abyss between us, but we can bridge it with our imagination. And he practiced that with his students. So, for me personally, he just helped me bridge a lot of these worlds that I was traveling in. And he showed me that it's possible to do so with a lot of grace. And more broadly, he has a lot to say to the world right now, I think. And so I'm trying with others to, including his son and several other students, to bring some of those messages, and more importantly than anything else, the methods that he used for that kind of moral reflection out into the world. And that's the work that we're doing now.
Hmm. Can I really quickly, I want to ask you something about that before we jump to the Witness Institute and dive into that a little bit with the time we have left. But I know a lot of people, Ariel, who either, it seems like they're either in kind of the thinking world or they're in the action world. And what you're talking about is bridging the two, like that we need the two to actually come together. And I'm thinking about this generation of kids growing up with all the social media and, like you talk about, the polarization, the divisions that we have. Where can they get that connection between thoughtfully engaging and then acting upon that, not separating the two? Where do they go to come together to do this well?
Well, I believe very strongly and very deeply that every human being has the capacity to do this, that there's a spark of wholeness and goodness in every person. And that's not limited to certain generations. So no matter how much the challenges seem, um, overwhelming sometimes, young people right now are dealing with all the social media stuff, which many people have written about, but also this pandemic and the isolation that comes with it, and inhabiting this kind of weird digital space all the time, going to school on Zoom or going back to school or back and forth, and the sense of uncertainty and unsafety. I know I'm feeling as an adult, but if I were feeling as a young person, it would form me in very profound ways. Those things are real, and yet I believe there's a lot of resilience and a lot of power and a lot of hopefulness in who young people are coming up right now. I'm thinking of my kids. I'm thinking of some younger students I've encountered. I also believe that there are tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of really powerful and sincere and deeply committed teachers out there who aren't always supported to do their work in the ways that we need them to be. And there are certainly systemic issues to tackle in our education system. But around the world, there are people who choose to be teachers because they know that this is one of the most powerful, precious things you can do with your life. My parents are both retired teachers also. So, I feel like I feel a real sense of reverence when I encounter a teacher. The work is challenging because thinking and acting are so different. They tap into different parts of us, and even more, make it more complicated. I think the work involves both speeding up, meaning reacting quickly when you see something that's unjust, learning how to be more aggressive in standing up against hatred and injustice, being more vocal, giving voice to people who don't have a voice, giving voice to people who don't have a platform, really noticing who's not included in conversations at every level and making sure those people have a seat at the table. All of that requires a kind of aggressive ferocity. And on the other hand, we have to slow down and we have to reflect and listen and be humble and ask questions and ask, well, what am I missing? Am I getting something wrong here? Those are two opposite kinds of impulses and capacities. We need to do both. And I've seen examples of people who, and I've seen in myself examples of moments when I have been too slow to act or respond to things that are wrong. And I've also seen moments where I was too quick to respond and my response wasn't nuanced enough and I didn't get it right. Right. And that happens when we move too quickly or too slowly. So how do we teach both? How do we teach that kind of, the contemplative side and the quick, effective action side of things? That is the hardest nut to crack in the work that I'm doing. I believe it's possible in two ways. Number one, when we're in small communities, small circles of people, we can actually divide and conquer. We can balance each other out. So if there's an area or an issue in which you're very quick to respond and you've done some thinking about it, but you know where you stand and you're taking aggressive action because you want to make change, and I'm more in a contemplative place asking questions, well, we can give to each other. We can really benefit from each other, from contact with one another. So we can distribute those functions in a certain way in small, maybe even in a buddy system. I also think it's much harder to do, but it's still possible to do within one single person, to have sort of two buttons, if you imagine, or like a graphic equalizer, on an old boombox where you've got like bass and treble. So you've got these two different capacities. And right now I need to raise the bass. I need to raise the space for contemplation. I need to really think, ask harder questions, talk to people who have different perspectives, do that difficult dialogue work, complicate the issues, look for the nuance. Now I need to raise the treble. There's stuff happening. Someone needs my help right now, or there's hatred right now. There's racism happening in my region or in my nation or my neighborhood. I need to act. There's anti-Semitism happening in our country that is often unreported, and yet every Jew I know feels afraid right now. We need to act. We need to stand up about those issues. We need to do it for our own communities, but we also especially need to do it for our fellow communities, across communities. So I sort of need to have both capacities at my fingertips. I need to then have the meta clarity to know, well, when do I activate the speed, the aggressivity, the ferocity? When do I slow down to ask questions? And it's a hard thing. There's no formula that I found to tell you when do you do each one of those things, but clearly they need to be in our repertoire. And practicing these things together is the most important thing. We're going to get it wrong sometimes. We're going to make mistakes. That's okay. We don't have to be perfect, but we have to continue to grow and deepen our thinking and our acting with others. We have to do it together.
I love what you're saying, and you're actually really tapping into my heart and what I've been really digging into the last couple of years for sure. So I appreciate the balance again that you're bringing into this, but also the urgency, the contemplative action, but also, the contemplative action. So it's like an interesting combination. So thank you for keeping that. I did want to know, like, about the Witness Institute. I feel like you and I was doing a little research, and I was really impressed with your fellows. And I feel like maybe what you're doing is you are discipling a smaller group of people. Is that what, I mean, I would love to hear what you're doing with the Witness Institute.
Well, first of all, we're doing this together. So our fellows are just remarkable, passionate people. They're working on different issues. They're activists and leaders and educators with a deep sense of brokenheartedness in the best way, meaning open-heartedness, meaning vulnerability and willingness to tackle difficult issues in the world, but also their own tight places, their own dark places, and the sincerity that drives their work, and the passion, the caring and concern that drives their work is incredibly inspiring to me. So just to back up, I mean, when Professor Wiesel was teaching still at Boston University, but was getting older, we started a conversation about what would it look like to create an institute initially for training teachers based on his approach to moral education, because he had this very unique set of approaches and tools and methods that was very effective and very, very much needed in society at the time. This is around 2008. And we started a conversation about it. For various reasons, we put it on the back burner for several years, and later restarted the conversation with him, and then later with his son, Elie Wiesel. And we started bringing together some other students of Professor Wiesel and other people who had never heard of Elie Wiesel, who were activists, scholars, educators, designers, curators, network weavers, people from many different walks of life, and importantly, with very different ideological and political perspectives, to ask, what would it look like to draw on this legacy? Let's test it out together. So we spent a year kind of test driving this approach, taking his tools and methods with a group of 20 people and meeting regularly. This is at the beginning of the pandemic, so it was all on Zoom. And it was remarkable that we were able to go to places of real openness and vulnerability and honesty and disagreement and dialogue, and strengthening, identifying muscles that we didn't even know were there. The ferocity muscle, the let's get more comfortable with conflict muscle, the humility and listening muscle, the making room for others and giving them the mic muscle. There are a lot of different capacities here that we started to identify. And out of that, we had a sense that there's something here that we need to continue to implement and apply, especially for emerging leaders, leaders who have tremendous potential but haven't yet arrived at like the pinnacle of their careers. They're still in formation, they're still learning. Hopefully we're all always in formation, but people who are really thirsty for that kind of learning and growth. And we pulled together our first cohort of this fellowship, the Witness Fellowship, a little over a year ago, about a year ago. And we've been meeting regularly to do a deep dive into this work. And so some of it is studying Professor Wiesel's teachings, watching videos of him teaching and talking about some of the things that he challenged us to explore, or looking at the literature that he loved and pointed us to. Some of it was Jewish literature, teachings of the Hasidic masters of 200 years ago. That's a mystical movement from Eastern Europe with very existential, psychological, deep stories and teachings. But also, we've studied texts from the Bhagavad Gita to Sophocles and many other texts. And then we apply it to the lived realities and questions that our fellows are dealing with in their work and in their lives and in their missions. And the idea is that we do this learning together, we do this practice together, we develop as a group and as individuals and in buddies and in small groups within the group. And then every fellow creates a project to apply what they've learned and bring back to their community, their fields. So we're now in the midst of evolving and iterating and redesigning and pushing on those projects. And we're also in the midst of choosing our second cohort, which we're going to do, I think, by next week, maybe even the end of this week. So it's very exciting. We also do some public programming, some public learning. We've done some work with teachers, going back to the original seed of this idea, because teachers have a really tremendously important role to play. And all of it is about cultivating an open heart and an awake mind in the service of the thinking and activism you were talking about earlier, to create a world that's more compassionate, more courageous, more reflective, and ultimately based on the belief that Professor Wiesel taught us and held very dear. And as a Holocaust survivor, he had every reason to give up on the world, but he refused despair. He rejected despair. And he taught us that no matter what's happening in the world, we have to choose hope. And hope is the first moral choice. It's the choice that keeps you in the game. It's the choice that keeps you going. So we really believe that small moments matter, small encounters matter, and small actions matter, and that these things really do add up. And so that's our deep hope and our deep belief in our fellows, is that the work that they're doing will, in aggregate and individually, contribute to a more compassionate world.
Well, Ariel, I have about 100 different questions, but we got to wrap up. And I love that, how you say reject despair and choose hope. It's good. That's a good reminder to us all. And I think what you're saying too about the intersectionality of all of us, different people coming together, and then what can happen in that space. And I love how you're redefining really hard concepts, like conflict, like brokenheartedness. I heard that in there, and I wanted to ask you about 10 different questions about that, about us, that brokenheartedness isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? It could lead to something amazing. So I love how you're doing just really creative, innovative, hard work in this space. And I really believe that it's going to pay off dividends with each fellow, and as you work together. And I want to be a fellow. Now that you're talking, I'm like, pick me as a fellow. But so grateful that you came on. Thank you for coming on the podcast with us. And we're just going to keep cheering you on from a distance. And we're going to link all you guys to the Witness Institute and what Ariel is doing. And we didn't even get to talk about your art and any of that. And so I feel like at some point there needs to be a part 2 of this, if you're willing to come back.
I'm happy to do that. To do that. And we should definitely stay in touch in multiple levels. The work that you're doing is so deeply resonant with what we're trying to do. And for everyone out there, I would just say, I think one of the calls of this moment is probably to do what you just said, which is to question things and find our own definitions of the categories that we're encountering, instead of just sort of absorbing other people's definitions for us. We need a lot of fresh thinking. We need a lot of fresh experimentation to the problems we're facing today. Yeah,
good. Couldn't agree more. So make space to do that. As you're listening today, figure out, in the next week or 2, who do you need to talk to? Where could you process? And we're going to do this, guys. We're going to make it through this, and we're going to make this world better when we do things like this. So thank you for joining us for another episode of the podcast. We hope you guys loved it, and share it with those that you think might be encouraged. And we'll see you guys next time.